Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Second Samuel. Today, we are going to pick up in our reading in Second Samuel, and we are, if we remember, in the story of David. So David is now the king. He is the ruler of God's people, and we have already begun to see David winning some military victories. Of course, he's most famous for the Goliath victory, the personal victory, but he was also a very successful, a general, kind of a field general, a commander of his armies, or of the Lord's armies. So David was very successful in battle, and that's what we see here right at the beginning with the two lands of Ammon and Syria. And we can see there at the beginning with Ammon, David had an alliance with the father of the new king. And so he had an alliance with the father of the old king. So when the father of the new king. So when the new king becomes king because his father had died, David sends some advisors to him, and his advisors kind of foolishly say David's not actually going to keep up with his promise that he made to your father, and he's going to attack you. He's going to take us out. He's going to defeat you in battle. And so they foolishly decide to fight against David. And of course, the Israelites at this point had already been through many battles, and so they're seasoned warriors, and they had little trouble winning this victory. And that's why it's kind of like a little cautionary tale there in chapter 10 of 2 Samuel, that you need to be careful who you take your advice from, because if you take your advice from somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about, they're going to lead you in a direction you don't want to go. And for the people of Ammon, it led to military defeat. And so David, so far so good with his story, but in chapter 11 things change. So we have a very famous story of David and Bathsheba. And if we came to Camp Pacomath not this past weekend, the weekend before, if you went to our Camp Pacomath Youth Retreat, then you remember we talked a decent amount about David and Bathsheba. But just in case you missed it, and if you did, if you're a youth that missed it, shame on you. But if you're somebody else that just didn't get to go, we'll still cover this. So David and Bathsheba, that whole episode starts in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. So one spring, David, he just decides not to go to war. And that starts in 11 chapters, like right at verse 1. And so no doubt he feels that he deserves a rest, a chance to take a well-earned break, and leave the fighting to the others. In his idleness, David starts an affair with the beautiful wife of one of his soldiers. Her name is Bathsheba. Her husband Uriah the Hittite is one of David's finest men. Her father Eliam is also one of David's famous 30 mighty warriors, and her grandfather is the wise and subtle counselor Ahithophel. So this is a pretty important person from a pretty important line, and here David is doing things he shouldn't. So David is home from battle when he should have been away at battle with his people, because that's what was done in those days. That's how war was fought. The king would go with his men. David decided not to, and while he's home, he sees Bathsheba, decides he wants Bathsheba. He takes Bathsheba, and then she conceives and becomes pregnant, and now David is in a whole world of trouble. So David brings Uriah home from battle, and he encourages him to spend a few nights with his wife. But this man is a professional soldier, and he's an honorable man, so he sleeps in the guardhouse. David then tries another plan. He sends a letter to his commander Joab with instructions that Uriah be sent where the fighting is fiercest and then left to die. And one thing has led to another, and David's lack of self-discipline has resulted in adultery, deceit, and murder. At first, David thinks that he has hidden his crime and gotten away with it, but God knows, and so does his prophet Nathan. Remember, sin is always found out, and it always comes with the price. The Bible tells us that nothing done in the dark does not eventually come to light, and that is happening for David right here. So the prophet Nathan comes, and he talks to David, and he gives him this story, this powerful story of a rich man who has flocks of sheep, but he, just to sum it up, he takes the only sheep that this one poor man has to feed to his guest that's coming to have dinner. And so he had the rich man who had all that he could ever need and didn't have to take anyone, and instead he takes this lamb from this poor man who didn't have a lot, and it was basically his pride and joy. And David, he hears this and he's furious, and he says, who could do such a thing? Tell me who it is, and he'll be put to death. Until Nathan says, It's you, David. A king with wives and mistresses to spare has stolen a soldier's only wife and taken his life as well. And so here is a turning point for David's reign. Until now, everything has gone right. After this, everything goes wrong. David repents before God with all his heart. And we even have his words in Psalm 51. He says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Against you, you only have I sinned. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." So eventually, Bathsheba's baby dies, but soon she and David have another son, and they name him Solomon. Solomon will inherit his father's throne, and he will become a king of legendary wealth and wisdom. He's going to fulfill David's dream of building a temple for the Lord in Jerusalem, and we see how God takes even our disobedience and our failure and works them into his perfect plan. David did something he was never supposed to do. He did something terrible, and it resulted in a man's death. But God still made something great happen out of it, and that was in the form of Solomon. Solomon's name comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. Nathan arrives with another name as well, Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord, and this baby will not die. And so after that, we have in the end of chapter 26, the end of the defeating of the Ammonites, the conquest of the Ammonites in their capital, Rabbah, is a considerable success. Joab is a loyal general, and he wants his king to have the honor of capturing the city. And so then we see some bad things kind of start to happen to David, and this is all kind of something that happens as a result of his own sin. So David has this son named Amnon, and who he is David's oldest son. And he does one thing, and his other son, Absalom, do these terrible things. And so the reason these things can happen is David, what he's done with Bathsheba and what he did with Uriah, they make it very difficult for him to correct his own sons because they know too much about him. They know the evil that he's done. They know his sins. And so it's harder for David to correct them. And so here we see something that is kind of a terrible thing that's getting ready to unfold. And the first thing we see is Amnon. So Amnon is David's eldest son and the heir to the throne. He's infatuated with Princess Tamar, but he can't marry her because she is his half-sister. A crafty cousin, Jonadab, advises Amnon to pretend to be sick. The king will then send Tamar to look after him. All goes according to plan, and Tamar finds herself alone in Amnon's bedroom, and then despite her pleas, he seizes her, he rapes her, and then he has her thrown out. And so this is obviously a very sick, a very dark story, but it is something that happened, and this is something that's happened in David's family because as a result of his sin and his household kind of getting out of order. And then Tamar's brother's name is Absalom. When he finds her in mourning with ashes on her head and her royal robe turned, he immediately plans revenge. He's a patient man. It takes 2 years, but eventually Amnon is killed, and Absalom then goes into hiding. And so then Absalom rebels against his father. So the king and Absalom, they don't see each other for 3 years until Joab devises a way of bringing them together. He gets a wise old woman to come to King David with the moving story of a son who needs forgiveness. David sees that she's describing Absalom and allows him to return home. But David ignores his son for another 2 years, and so then Absalom grows angry and rebellious. Absalom is this striking, good-looking man. He's especially proud of his long hair, and one day he acquires a chariot and 50 men and starts to pose as a king in waiting. So Absalom was a bad man, but he was a good politician. The people loved him when he pretended to care for them. And we can see that in chapter 14, that Absalom was a man that was loved by the people because he had a way of making the people feel that he cared about them, even if he really didn't. And so Absalom eventually goes on to Hebron to begin his rebellion in the same place that David became king. And so as we continue in this story, like starting next week in chapter 15, we're going to see exactly what Absalom does. And just to to be a spoiler here, Absalom is going to start this rebellion, and he's going to lead this rebellion against his father. And we remember all of this started with sin. It started with the sin of David with Bathsheba, and it started after that with David not having like the moral authority to really tell his sons what was right and what was wrong. And now here we are with one of his sons being murdered, one of David's daughters being raped, and now we also have this other son who is trying to steal the throne from his father, from David, the man that God wants to be king. And so that's where we're going to leave this off today. I will see you guys back here tomorrow in the Book of Psalms.